here. And tonight I'm going to talk about adjectives and nouns and the hyphen and death in about 20 minutes or so. And I guess to start off with, you mentioned there's a book of mine that was published last year called Uproot, Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture. And so a lot of this book deals with this idea of looking back at the last 20 years in music. So starting off like I did as a DJ with lots of vinyl records, lots of cassettes, lots of CDs, and trying to put those together, think about sound and think about how sound travels, and then seeing all the changes that have emerged with the arrivals of MP3s, with the arrival of YouTube, 2005, with things like inexpensive laptops, cracked software, and how all those changes that accompanied the shift from analog to digital, how they transform the way we listen to music, the way we make music, the way we share music, and basically the way we sort of, how human expression is exploding in this digital era. And so many of the themes of Uproot are very closely tied to the themes of this festival, and throughout the book I was particularly interested in not just sort of discussing these changes from the sort of from an industry perspective, and then SoulSeek arrived, and then streaming arrived, but also I wasn't interested in sort of following the big stars. It's not a book about superstar DJs. It's not a book about Tiesto. I was going through and looking at how people often outside of the West are making use of these sort of new technological conditions to interact with the world. And how that affects ideas of global and local. So that's all in there. But I thought tonight, last night I was here for Lamin's presentation. And I thought tonight I could actually kind of hover in this space of Afro-Tech and actually just kind of think about that word and back to the hyphen. And so, of course, Afro-Tech, it's related, at least to me, to Afrofuturism. Afro-Tech and Afro-American. And in all these cases, I'm looking at it and I'm just thinking of what does it mean to have Afro as an adjective? Because in all these different situations, it's a modifier, which is to say it's not the noun, it's the thing that sort of tweaks it or gives it a bit of a shift or a different take on things. So in a way, these terms like Afrofuturism and even African-American, to me, they put a distinction. It's not about the part about the Afro, the part about the sort of blackness, it's not what I would call the control signal. It's not the main story being told. It's some sort of addition to that story, or a supplement to that story, or an accent to that story. It gives it soul, or something like that. And so in a way, it's something like a little bit. So I'm thinking about the work of the hyphen. What is that doing? And for example, my problem with the term African-American and then the hyphen, I was like, this is this really interesting moment when, it's like, oh, African-American, at least in an American context, it's considered a polite way to say black. But it's so strange to me because it's positioning the sort of black American as somehow outside of the American state and whatever that means. It's a hyphenated identity instead of a kind of a singular or a solid identity. And which is deeply weird for me as a black American, as a black person, because I'm like, blacks in America are actually uniquely American. So all the violence, all the confusion, all the incoherency that we're seeing resurging right now, in the last 10 months or so, all that was there in the presence of America really kind of in a way created like whatever the black person is. And so in a way I have obviously somewhere I have African roots, but I'd like to think of a black American experience as beginning with that rupture. So you could say it's beginning with Middle Passage. You could even think about the hyphen as this weird sort of typographical form of Middle Passage. But there is something about splitting off the black from the American experience. So it's both a depressing term, African American to me, especially when people use it to try and be polite, but it's also a strangely accurate term because there is something about what does it mean to be in a place where you are outside of mainstream discourse, where the sort of ordinary conduits of power are not necessarily open to you, that there's going to be some sort of friction within that. And so similarly with Afrofuturism, there's something about Of course, the futurists were fascists. They were Europe's most stylish fascists. But then Afrofuturism is all about temporal displacement. There's whether it's a dystopia, like Octavia Butler wrote about, or whether it's some sort of Drexian utopia, there's always something. It's never the here and the now. It's always this kind of like endlessly deferred sense of possibility. So in a weird way, Afrofuturism, to me, one of my problems with it is again, there's this kind of melancholy. It's something about the impossibility of change. We can only imagine, but there's no actuation. And so where do you go with that? How do you move within that sort of situation? But what I think, again, what I'm calling the work of the hyphen, especially in this term Afro-Tech, to me what some of that does is it makes it a little bit harder to think of blackness itself as a technology. And that's a question I find deeply interesting. Like, if blackness is a technology, what kind of technology is it? Blackness itself, and maybe in opposition to whiteness, maybe in and of itself, but then that gets me thinking of ideas of control. It's a technology, who has authored it? And when we think about technology in the very basic sense, it's usually this notion of a tool that helps us engage with our environment and kind of shape it or mold it in a way we want. But blackness as a technology is not necessarily kind of user-friendly like that. And so to me, when I'm sort of riffing on this thought of, well, what is, no hyphens, no dashes, blackness as a technology, what does that look like? And so I kind of come down to ideas of dispossession, this notion that's a technology of dispossession. And I think one of the, my sort of description of African American is this idea of the sort of Black American being slowly sort of pushed out of this American space at the level of language, at the level of politics. But maybe a nice way of talking about this notion of blackness as dispossession would be to use a musical example. And so this is a clip. Everyone knows Moby, right? He was really important in the sort of electronic music landscape because in 1999 he put out an album called Play. And this album was sort of very unremarkable, but after it was released, slowly Moby got more and more licensing for it. He licensed it to beer brands, to liquor brands, to car companies, to American Express, all these companies. And he ended up being the first person to license every single song on their album to some sort of commercial usage. Really incredible. And the only thing that made this album sort of at all unique or notable were these old Black American voices, old blues voices that Alan Lomax had recorded in the past. So they were free for him to use. And I'll play you some of these examples of the original and then what Moby did, and then I'll read a brief section of my book that sort of discusses this, not in context of authenticity or remix culture, but more specifically thinking about the power of dispossession.
Sometime my honey come back. Sometime I'm on a bad bad jack. Sometime I'm back. Sometime I'm on over here. Sometime my honey come back. Sometime I'm on a bad bad. I'm gonna find my baby. Woo! Before that sun goes down. I'm gonna find my baby. Woo! Before that sun goes down.
And some more.
Trouble so hard, ooh Lord, trouble so hard. Don't nobody know my trouble but God. Don't nobody know my trouble but God.
So sort of discussing what's going on with this album, I wrote, licensing the music so widely never presented Moby with an ethical dilemma. I found Play so upsetting, not because its core sonic identity comes from the voices of old African-American blues singers that Moby sampled and layered with atmospheric beats, but rather because brands such as American Express, Rolling Rock, Bailey's Ice Cream, Nissan, Volkswagen, Renault, and many more, because these brands were so ready to use those cushy decontextualizations to advertise their products. Moby didn't sell out, but he did insert his wares into a system that trades in the appearance of authenticity. Of course, black soulfulness repackaged and sold by whites is the very antithesis of what we understand as authenticity. But, as with play, that mediation consistently makes it more rather than less sellable. The very catchiest moments of play are built on the voices of poor Southern blacks, recorded decades earlier by Alan Lomax. The blues voices that loop inside of Moby's pop-friendly arrangements remind us that the central fact of black authenticity in America is dispossession, which makes Play a profoundly American album, and Moby, with his heart-on-sleeve diatribes, in full complicity with this complex machinery, a transitional figure. Let's get back to the images. And so, I started thinking about, Afrofuturism as again, temporal displacement, temporal dispossession. And all of this kind of slipperiness, which I'm discussing, which you can see it in Moby, you can see it all over the place, it's actually deeply embedded, of course, in DJ culture. And this is just one of my favorite examples of that. Here we go. Whoops. Anyhow, the computer's being unhappy. That's too bad. What's going on? Hey, here we go. It's because I was trying to invoke Red Bull. Wow. Yeah, here we go. Great. And also, that's a Joseph Beuys video in the background, which you can see in and out. But so again, thinking of dispossession, I'm thinking of like how the music culture I love, DJing, is so intimately tied to that. As you can see here, he's not actually DJing, but to me, the art of DJing there's something actually very poignant about taking these fragments of other people's recorded sound and kind of trying to spin them into your own narrative, and that's what we're doing here, it's what we'll be doing downstairs in a few minutes. But it's also so tied to this notion of slipperiness and all the notions of power and dispossession that come up. And so I'm thinking of one of the reasons why I believe that black culture is often sort of almost synonymous with music, with rap music and electronic music in particular, is because of the easiness, the porousness, which it can be sort of taken, versions, stretched out, the easiness with which it lends itself to a certain type of dispossession. And of course, it's, this is, what do you then do with that? It's a problematic which is simply there. And again, I'm thinking of blackness as a technology. I said it's not really user-friendly because it's a technology that creates problems. It's a technology that is itself a form of a problem. And often this problem will sort of repeat. Often it goes through different types of repetitions, but it's also mutating and very slippery. And now I'm going to briefly talk about one example I love about how to think through that type of problem. Is the work of a young Moroccan artist named Myriam Benani. And this is, I'm going to play a little clip of, this is a piece that she put on her Instagram feed. First I'll turn up this. She put this up January 21st. Man, this guy doesn't want to go. Here we go. Okay. Skip. So of course, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir at the inauguration. And I'll play it again, just so it goes by pretty fast. So again, this is Myriam Benani's sort of edit/intervention. Whoop. great, right? And I think is one of the reasons it's great, of course, is because they are voicing what I think many of us feel. You know, what happens when, you know, these sort of ridiculous displays of nationalism, all the tension and the chaos we're feeling. It's not about, you know, especially politics nowadays. It's no longer about a sort of rational discourse where I say something that's somehow legible to you and you respond. It's more about screaming and this weird miasmatic space of affect. So there's kind of like a realism in her replacing the anthem with screams. And then, of course, she's going through and she's taking this sort of this very mainstream discourse, this control signal, as you can say. And, you know, she's only kind of modulating it, interrupting it, rechanneling it, doing that sort of work of the hyphen. But she does it in such a way that all the sort of the nationalistic queasiness we get when we watch Fox News or CNN, all the cuts and the zooms, all the work of montage and editing that go together to make a sort of coherent visual, it kind of gets completely upended in her video. And of course, there's the use of humor. But this is my favorite moment, and this is to me like what speaks to today, which is that in the middle of it, you know, she kind of does a fake little glitch out. You get the spinning disc symbol, you know, that says that the computer is thinking or that something is loading. And then the woman's scream, which goes from ah, kind of pauses out and sounds a little bit electronic in a way. It's caught in a very, very small loop. And so this piece, of course, it's an Instagram joke, it's social media, it's a meme, but it kind of gets inside the way of how we can think about living and kind of communicating in this time. And again, sort of we're subsumed in this digital space. We can't escape it. That would be sort of ridiculous. You know, I'm as addicted to my cell phone as anyone else is. And similarly, this idea of blackness of technology, it's like there's a very complex and very aggressive power dynamic at hand, and simply stepping outside, not an option. But what you can do is find moments when the control signal modulation can itself turn into a different type of signal. So this ends up being a strangely hopeful piece. She's thinking about, well, what's that space where the computer, the machinery, the ideology is moving forward, it's on, but what if we stall out? What if we think about a pause in that? What if we look for a bit of, not quiet, because there's no more quiet, but a bit of a different approach to time, you know, kind of radical, cyclical time in the mainstream broadcast? How can that help us think in a different way? And how can that help us sort of, in a way, communicate in this very strange moment for communication? I think just briefly I'm going to talk about a piece of my own, which is informed by many of these themes. And this is a piece, it's a performance piece for 4 vocalists and the stock market, which I'm going to debut next summer down on Wall Street outside. And the piece is called Gabadu and the Moirai Index. And what it is, in a nutshell, it's, you know, again, thinking through many of these thoughts, a lot of it to me has to deal with the notion of a politics of representation, where, oh, we need to get these people together in the room, we need to be inclusive. Maybe that's less viable and important, or that's less important than a politics of kind of radical participation, where it's not, you know, just a sort of tokenism is going on. But more importantly, I keep on thinking about what does it mean to be an individual human subject now in the 21st century, in 2017, and all the ideas of personhood and identity and self-identity and voice, I think they're becoming less and less meaningless. Or the meaninglessness that they've always had is becoming more and more visible, more and more apparent. But that all of that is amplified by the ways in which any sort of individual agency I might have is constantly being shot through by my presence on social media, by strange algorithms, corporate algorithms. They're very distant, but they're controlling the Jace Clayton, the DJ Rupture that gets out there. Global finance, more interconnected than ever, and so much of that world is sort of offloaded and opaque to the vast majority of us. Ideas of gentrification, all of this, the sort of individual heroic struggle, whether the artist or the musician, you know, or the person writing the book, that's sort of less and less. So how do you create, for me as an artist, how do I create something that is awareness, that takes that as a baseline awareness. And so that led me to think of this piece. And so Gabadu, the Moirai are the Greek three fates, and Gabadu is a dual-gendered West African fate deity. And I said, okay, I'm gonna, thinking of Wall Street, New York City, you know, the capital of, one of the capitals of finance. I'm like, let's do a site-specific audio work for this place. But I'm thinking of Lower Manhattan and Wall Street not just as this is neoliberalism on blast. Let's also look at the sort of the long, you know, 300 or 400 year history of Lower Manhattan as, you know, for it's one of the things it was is a burial ground for blacks and African slaves. At least 30,000 bodies are there buried, where there are now courthouses and gigantic finance industries. But thinking of it, so thinking of Wall Street not in this particular moment, but the sort of wide temporality of it. But at the same time, all these thoughts on how the individual is kind of meaning less and less, I was like, how can I, what better way to think about that than to think about stock market, stock fluctuation? So the idea is that these four singers each will represent one of those goddesses, you know, the Greek three fates and the West African one. And each of those goddesses will have a stock portfolio. And so the idea is that throughout the course of the day, as their individual stocks, as they rise and fall, that data, I'm sort of gonna record that data, and then the performance will begin at 4 p.m. when the stock market closes. And it'll be a 20-minute piece, but I sort of compress, you know, 8 hours of data into 20 minutes of time. And so they will have their individual a cappella voices gathered in song, this moment of warm human soul, which is so pleasing to many of us. But yet all that gorgeous voice sound will be shot through and interrupted by the stock data, which will be pushing their voices around, doing different types of modulation and effects. And so to me, this was a way of, you know, thinking of all the importance of the voice in the individual, and then thinking of what it means to be this sort of distributed, networked, very strange citizen. And now, how can I somehow engage with that? And so Gabadu is my response. And I'm going to play you, the piece is still being written, but I'm going to play you some example audio. And this is using stock data from the big Shanghai market crash that occurred a year or two ago. And so one of the things about this particular performance, to reiterate, like it's a through composed piece. So all the music's scored. The singers will be doing the exact same thing every day. We'll perform it on Monday through Friday. But because of all the various market instabilities, all the different types of modulations that are happening in their voices will change. So the piece is a stable entity, but part of the algorithms, part of all the stock data is incorporated into it. So it's actually going to be a kind of a very different experience just from one day to the next, depending on what's happening with the market. And I think that's a good place to pause and open things up to a kind of living room discussion, response. If anyone has any questions. Was I clear?
I will just try to warm up the room and start with the question. So you talked about, you started with the example of Moby, which is of course not the only one who's using these old blues voices. I think for me personally, when Play came out, I wasn't even aware of what kind of voices he used, and I think it's really like just 3, 4, 5 years back that in Europe this discussion came about anyway. So maybe you can tell us a bit if and how there was a reaction in the general public in the US when it came out, if there was a discussion or when it came, maybe.
I mean, it's funny because in a way Moby was never terribly respected. You know, he's kind of seen as like a sellout, I think, probably accurately. But yeah, I was kind of, but you know, but yeah, things trickle through the years. People are using, oh, this is an example of cultural appropriation. You know, what are the rights of these dead poor singers? How does sampling culture reinforce kind of dominant power structures, that sort of thing? But I guess when I was writing about it, I wanted to put a different spin on that. It's like, how can we engage with some of those questions, but without falling back on the sort of on this idea of a certain type of like easy authenticity. And that's why I'm making this claim. I'm like, the central fact about Black life to me is dispossession. It's not like soulfulness or a good dancer or musicality, you know, or anything like that. It's actually the simple fact of like having something that is widely considered yours to be taken away from you, and that's the thing. So I was hoping to use this very kind of broad reference of Moby, but to kind of shift the terms of debate a little bit. And because most of the debate was like, oh yes, all this, people were talking about the money, which is fascinating and important, and then talking about, of course, the samples and their origins and all of that.
Anyone else? Since we're all together, we can maybe just loosen it up. And
Yeah. And the funny thing was, I didn't talk about this project I have called Sufi Plugins, which was kind of, I'm like, people sort of, an instance where I explicitly went out to thinking about Afro-Tech. 5 years ago, I was like, okay, I'm going to make music software based on non-Western ideas of sound. The interface is going to be in this beautiful Berber language. As you move around the program, the info tips will show you bits of Sufi poetry, and it's going to do things, be like hardwired to Arabic scales, and like how can we encourage a sort of how can we encourage thinking about difference or thinking about sameness in a digital space? But that's another talk for another place.
if there are no questions from you, I'll just have one last, since you already mentioned Afro-Tech. When we started the project, of course, we did a broad internet search of, is it already taken, like this? And yeah, do you know about that? Could you maybe tell us a bit about that? Because I was so stunned when I found it, and I thought, well, never mind, we'll use it anyway in a very, very different way.
Oh, no, I mean, it's funny, it's like the first search term that comes up if you're looking for Afro-Tech. You know, it's like Silicon Valley's largest gathering of blacks and African Americans. It's like, great, you know, I'm happy for them. Yeah, and like there's a lot of, yeah, I mean, one of the things that was actually really interesting when we had our brief discussion earlier, you said this part of this conference was pairing people sort of theorizing Afrofuturism, which often has this kind of positivist or like leftist kind of humanist thing, with entrepreneurs from the continent who are like, I'm making an app, this is my solar powered kiosk, like this is sort of, you know, these are like actual conditions of technology made in Africa, happening in Africa. I'm like, oh, that's actually really exciting. We can get those different types of discourses together and talking to each other. And so a lot of my sort of the criticism of the Afrofuturism, I'm like, there's a lot of bad art, you know, it's like, and there's, but often it's kind of, it's not, in a way, it's very disconnected from real world conditions. And so I always like to say that it's like, you know, it's really fun to talk about black music, and it's like not fun at all to talk about like black facts, you know, like, which are many, and, you know, from like, okay, let's get sociological on it, like income disparities, political laws, lawmaking, colonial histories, any number of things. I'm like, that's not fun. Whereas I feel like the people active, you know, like entrepreneurs from Kenya, there's something when you are in that sort of commercial paradigm, in a way, when you're trying to make a product which, you know, the goal of any sort of digital technology is to get as a wide a user base as possible, almost always, you know, like that's what's so scary about Facebook, or Google, you know, all these things. It's just a very small, incredibly homogenous like, you know, creator base who's doing things that where the user base will be 1 billion people, and you're like, that is terrifying. And so thinking of something about like what a minoritarian digital engagement could look like is actually really urgent. But then getting those people who are trying to like make it big, but are coming from a different perspective than you're going to get in Silicon Valley, is exciting to me.
Well, I think maybe we can get a connection between Afro-Tech, Silicon Valley, and the entrepreneurs, and maybe also like the artists and cultural scientists to maybe meet up. That would be such a funny coming together. Anyway, I think since everyone's standing and it's quite crowded, you will stick around. So if you have questions you don't want to scream in the room, you can always come to Jace, I suppose, and ask him questions, and we will hear your DJ set later on. So I think in about 10 minutes downstairs the Kondi Band will start, and I highly recommend you all to see them, not just but also because those two have been coming here just for one night. They come from Sierra Leone and from LA. They arrived this morning. They will leave tomorrow morning back to LA and to Sierra Leone, and they would really love to perform for you as the start of the end of Afro-Tech Fest. And you did some thank yous in the beginning, and I would like to do some thank yous as well. Of course, Rekorder again. You, Jace, thank you, Lamin, for putting all of this last night together, the whole team of the HMKV, which without all of this would not have happened, and of course Fabian Safira Lara, without all of this would not have happened because he curated all of this. And I think a warm round of applause for the whole Afro-Tech, and let's party.